Hello, it's Jacinta Banks, and this is your supplemental recording for week 3 to highlight some of the topics from the reading and relate them to the course project we're working on. So, in chapter 8, we are learning about creative strategy. So, once you've developed your objectives, your goals and objectives for the campaign, it's important to start developing strategies that will support those goals and objectives and to help to achieve them. So the creative strategy is a major part of that because a creative strategy spells out exactly what your messaging will be to your target audience. So as you look at a campaign, um, and the book talks about the advertising campaign, but we know we're developing an integrated marketing communication campaign, so it won't only include advertising. And the book does a lot space to those other elements other than advertising, such as sales promotion and PR, but we'll look at those later. But as you're developing the campaign, you know that it's important to have all of your elements to be coordinated. So you have an overall theme that is woven throughout your entire campaign. So that theme should be based on what your central message is. What's the most important thing that needs to be communicated to your target? And oftentimes brands will distill that theme down into a short, catchy slogan that you'll see them using throughout their campaign. So that's equivalent to the Nike "Just Do It" or the Red Bull "It Gives You Wings." That kind of theme that you saw those brands were able to weave that theme throughout the entire campaign. So the goal is to come up with something like that for your client that captures the central message that needs to be communicated in a way that you can weave it throughout the campaign. So I mentioned that already. So the creative brief, even though you're not required to do one, I wanted to just look at some of the components of it. It's all about establishing upfront what your advertising campaign, or really your integrated marketing communications campaign in our case. What are you trying to solve? What problem are you trying to solve? What are you trying to achieve? What are the communications objectives? And then what target audience are you trying to reach? And as you reach that audience, what is the major selling idea that you're trying to communicate, or the key benefits that you're trying to communicate with that target? And so then how will you craft your message to that target to deliver those key benefits, to communicate that major selling idea? And you will do that through the theme that we talked about, but also through the appeal and the execution strategy that you use, which we'll talk about here in a moment. So the major selling idea is that number one thing that you want to say about your product or service. It's the message that you think will have the most meaning to your target. That's what your major selling idea is. And you can base that on a number of things. You can base it on your unique selling proposition. You can base it on sort of the inherent drama that we'll talk about in a moment. You can base it on your positioning that you've already established, how you want to position your brand to that target. Or you can craft a brand image and base your selling your selling idea on that. So the unique selling proposition is, communicating the benefits of your offering in a way that's unique, that differentiates your offering from the competition. And it has to be communicated in a way that connects with your target. So it needs to be a great enough benefit that it really connects with your target. And so that was one way of developing that major selling idea. Another way is creating a brand image, and that's basically just developing a campaign that you're just promoting a certain image about your brand. And you can do that through using certain symbols that consumers or people who see that campaign will connect. They'll perceive your brand a certain way because of the symbols that you've incorporated into the brand. We see that with that's what Marvel was able to do with the Marble Man. People would see that cowboy image and they'd have a certain perception about that brand. So that's one way to really, you know, form that major selling idea that we talked about. Another way is to find the inherent drama and communicate that. So it's really communicating the benefits of your offering in a way that sort of adds a dramatic flair to it. And we saw that in the Hallmark campaign when you know, this is dating me a little bit, but you care enough to send the very best. It's a very dramatic statement, but you know, they're connecting their brand with this sense of drama that says, wow, you cared enough to send the very best to me. And it kind of communicates a lot about the brand in just that simple statement. So creating some sort of drama around the benefits of your product is another way of crafting that major selling idea. And the last way is to use your positioning statement. So you've already established how you want consumers to perceive your brand, and you will communicate to them in a way to help craft that perception in their minds. So basically, you know, that would be what you would use as your major selling proposition, or your major selling idea is your positioning. You know, the strategies that you've already chosen to use to differentiate yourself in the minds of your target audience. So the key is you want to choose a major selling idea or a big idea that can be woven across multiple media channels. You want to be able to choose something that's adaptable and that really connects with your target audience. So now moving into chapter 9, it's all about starting to implement and evaluate the creative strategy that you formulated that we formulated back in chapter 8. And to implement that strategy, you really have to identify a couple of things. You have to identify your advertising appeal and your creative execution style. So let's look at both of those. For advertising appeal, it's how do you, how are you going to get the attention of your consumer? Are you going to do that in a way that's informational and rational? You're going to appeal to their logic and focus on providing features and benefits so that you could, get their attention that way. And there are a number of different types of informational appeals discussed in our reading. You know, competitive appeals, favorable price appeals, news appeals, popularity appeals. So you have to figure out which one of those makes the most sense. Or maybe an information appeal isn't the right one. Maybe it needs to be an emotional appeal that connects at a deeper level than just their logic. It sort of connects more at an emotional level. And there are a number of ways to do that, both positive emotions and negative emotions. So, you can appeal to their sense of love and affection, or you can appeal to their sense of fear and grief. And you can even appeal to feelings that people associate with more of a social setting, like recognition and status. We see that a lot. Products that are communicating status and trying to appeal to a person's desire to achieve a certain status. So the execution technique is how you bring that appeal to life. So are you doing that through a basic factual approach to selling that message in, or are you giving more of a scientific approach, saying that research has proven or experts say? Are you providing demonstrations? Are you providing product, comparisons against other products? Do you have people giving testimonials or endorsements? Do you have like real life scenarios where there's a problem and your product or service is the solution to that problem? Are you using animation or other symbols, imagery, dramatization? There are lots of different execution techniques discussed in our reading, humor, which we've seen a lot. And of course, you can use some sort of combination of any of these. So that's an important aspect of your creative strategy, is developing your advertising appeal and also your execution technique. Now let's look at a few components of a print ad. Um, you have your headline, your subheads, your body copy, any visual elements like drawings or illustrations, and then just they fit into the overall layout of how everything's put together. So your headline is obviously your most, that's your key message where you're trying to draw their attention. But you then have a secondary message that's in your subhead. And then, of course, the main text portion of the ad is, where you include additional information. So here's an example of what that looks like. And you'll notice in the example that you have to prioritize. Everything on the ad can't be of equal importance. So the placement of each element, as well as the size and weight you give to each element, should reflect the importance of that element. So in terms of television advertising, obviously there's a video component and an audio component, and we know there's a lot involved in both of those in terms of music and imagery and all of that wonderful, all the wonderful things you can include in a television ad, all of the rich media you can include. Now, if you decide to do a television ad for our client, if you think that is the right recommendation, then you would, of course, write the script versus actually producing a television ad. So keep that in mind. If you decide to do something like a radio spot or television ad, you would just be writing the script, or you could even do a storyboard if that's something that you feel you want to recommend to the client, maybe on a local level. So a lot goes into planning and producing a television commercial. So you'll read all about that in the book if you haven't already done so. But again, you would only be submitting the script. So once you've developed your creative strategy, it's important to make sure that it aligns with what you're trying to achieve overall for the campaign. So once you've sort of outlined your strategy, you should go back and check out your communication objective and make sure that your creative strategy does help to achieve that objective. It's very important to make sure that there's alignment. Make sure that your creative strategy will actually speak to the target audience that you're trying to speak to. Is that message the right message for your target? Does that message represent your client in an authentic and truthful way? So it's important to go back and evaluate once you've made these creative decisions to make sure that they align with the rest of what the work that you've done up until this point. So I'm switching gears. We're moving into chapter 10, which is all about media planning and strategy. And so once we've done our situation analysis and we've established the marketing strategy and the creative strategy, we need to make sure that we choose the right media options for getting our message to the target audience. And there are lots of different options available to us, but that process is very detailed and very in-depth and covered very well in chapter 10. But it starts out with making those media mix decisions, knowing that you're likely going to use a number of different options to create a media mix that will ultimately help you reach your target. You'll want to cover a certain percentage of your target market. You'll want to make sure you're covering the geographies that you desire to cover, and that you're able to schedule your media coverage in a way that's effective, that you're able to reach the number of people you need to reach and as frequently as you'd like to reach them. And there are a lot of different aspects of developing this media plan that we won't go into, but keep in mind that if developing that plan does take into account the schedule and how frequently you're able to communicate your message through each medium. So that's important to think about, because the schedule and the frequency, and also impacts the budget. So if you're trying to do you know, if you're trying to have continuity, then you're looking at spending more money, and obviously pulsing would also require a higher outlay of dollars, versus doing something like a flighting schedule. So it's important to keep that in mind as you make recommendations, that you have to work within the budget that the client has. So there are pros and cons to each type of schedule. And for example, a continuity schedule kind of keeps you on the consumer's mind, whereas a flighting schedule is more cost efficient, as I said. And so you have to think about, okay, what's the best schedule for the budget, but also for what we're trying to achieve, looking at the advantages of each type of scheduling method. So as you're developing your media campaign, you'll want to make sure that it's reaching, it's the magnitude of, has the magnitude of reach and frequency that you're looking for. And rating points is one way to help quantify that. So GRPs helps summarize the overall weight of your campaign, and it's basically the reach, time, the frequency. Whereas target rating points actually focuses in on the number of people within your target audience that you're able to reach with the campaign. So it helps to eliminate the waste that we know can sometimes be embedded in campaigns. So of course you have to be able to compare the cost of different media options. And one way to do that is to convert it to a similar metric. Cost per thousand is one that's often used. Cost per rating point is another. And but our book talks about target cost per thousand, which is a way to hone in specifically on the cost per thousand that each media option costs for the target audience specifically. So what's the cost to reach the target audience, which is a more important measure than just a general cost. So as with anything, we have to evaluate our media decisions, and we have to make sure that the choices that we made achieve the media objectives, which also should achieve the overall campaign objectives. And there's also a really neat chart in this chapter that talks about the different advantages and disadvantages of certain media options. So this will be very helpful when you get to the point of making recommendations. We're not there yet. This will be in the tactics and implementation portion of the project that you do next week, that you'll get to the point of making more detailed recommendations about which media options to use. So when you get to that point, looking at the advantages and disadvantages listed in these charts would be very, very helpful. And these are found in Chapter 10. So Chapter 11 goes into detail on evaluation of television and radio specifically, and talks about some of the advantages of each of these options. And for the sake of time, I am not going to go into all of the advantages and disadvantages, but I do encourage you to take a closer look at those, especially for next week when you're starting to make decisions about whether you will use one medium over another. So think about television, think about cable television. Do any of these options make sense for your client? Looking at, obviously, if it's a local organization, you would be looking at local options. But do any of these options make sense from a budget perspective, from a perspective of who you're trying to reach? So this chapter also talks about radio, and it does have some nice charts in terms of some nice information in terms of the similarities between radio and TV. Um, so obviously they are both sort of focused at certain time periods, and there are different aspects of them that are similar, but there's also some differences. Radio tends to be a bit more efficient, effective. So you want to think about that, but it also, um, it's a difference in terms of imagery. You don't have the imagery right there, but sometimes if you have an ad that coincides with a television ad, consumers may visualize the ad more readily because of that. So radio has its advantages and disadvantages that are listed here that I will not go through for the sake of time on our video. So you have to think about, does it make sense to buy a radio spot, perhaps a local spot for your client? And if so, what would that messaging look like? What would that script look like? Chapter 12 goes into media evaluation for magazines and newspapers. So as you can see, we're starting out with the more traditional media options, and we'll get to digital and some of the other options later. But this chapter goes into talking about some of the benefits of magazines and newspapers, and the different classifications of magazines. We know that there are consumer magazines and business-to-business magazines, and it actually in the book makes the distinction for healthcare publications. So clearly a big enough market where it gets its own bucket in our book. But you have to think about, are there consumer magazines that would be a good fit for our client, and are there any business publications that would be a good fit for our client? Because there are business publications on so many different topics that target so many different types of professional groups. So you have to think about, are there any publications that are targeting professional groups or organizations that would allow us to reach a large number of people within our target audience? Might be an effective way to do that if you're able to reach a large number of people within the target. As these different types of publications may have their own lists already. So that's one thing you want to think about. So obviously, as with the other ones we spoke about, there are pros and cons to each, and you'll want to take a look at these as you make your recommendations to see if it makes sense to use magazines or newspapers to support your client's marketing communication plan. Okay, so this last section is on newspapers, and I'm going to expedite because I realize this video is getting very long. So, check out the advantages, check out the disadvantages of each medium, and determine if it makes sense to use it for your client, the plan that you're developing for your client. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know.